Disclaimer. This video contains general legal information for educational purposes only. It is not legal advice specific to your situation. While every effort has been made to ensure accuracy, laws can change and vary by jurisdiction. If you are considering publishing content that may raise legal concerns, you should seek independent legal advice. The creator of this video accepts no responsibility for how the information is used or interpreted. All the critiques in this video are offered in good faith for the purpose of religious discussion, public interest, and human rights analysis, which are explicitly recognized as lawful purposes under both the current and upcoming legislation. Islam, the world's fastest-growing religion, and arguably one of the most dangerous in terms of ideology when taken literally. Infamously known for its associations with terrorism, repression of women's rights, censorship of speech, retaliation against critics, child marriage, and the almost worship of a pagan stone. Its texts explicitly call for the violent subjugation of unbelievers and the killing of Jewish people. This is not opinion, it's documented in the texts. Islam must be criticized, and urgently so. While there are positive elements of Islam, the bad overwhelmingly outweighs the good. So how can we criticize Islam in Australia without violating the law? That's what this video is about. How to fulfill your moral duty to expose ideological darkness while staying out of prison and away from expensive legal battles. The most important law to understand in Victoria is the Racial and Religious Tolerance Act 2001 and the Criminal Code Amendment, Hate Crimes, Bill 2025. If you're in a different state, simply search for the equivalent legislation in your area. It's largely similar across Australia. Let's start with the Tolerance Act, Section 7. A person must not, on the ground of the race of another person or class of persons, engage in conduct that incites hatred against, serious contempt for, or revulsion or severe ridicule of, that other person or class of persons. This is not so relevant to criticizing Islam, because Islam is not a race, and neither are Muslims our race. There is no one race of Muslims or Islam. However, if you are discussing race in relation to Islam, be careful not to incite racial hatred. Even if it was not against the law, this is good advice. Section 8 is the most important section for you to know. It is among the most absurd pieces of legislation in all of Australia and has been thoroughly critiqued by various legal experts, but we still need to follow it. It states, a person must not, on the ground of the religious belief or activity of another person or class of persons, engage in conduct that incites hatred against, serious contempt for, or revulsion or severe ridicule of, that other person or class of persons. It's important to understand that this is talking about people, such as Muslims. It is not talking about religion, such as Islam. You can absolutely cause people to have serious contempt for Islam, the religion, and you should do that since it is an unjustly violent and immoral religion. But you cannot and should not incite hatred against, serious contempt for, or revulsion or severe ridicule of Muslims. And you do this by explaining that Islam and Muslims are not the same. Many Muslims are thoroughly ignorant of their own religion. They don't know many of the evil texts within Islam, and if they do, they reject, ignore, or reinterpret them. They are not truly following Islam, and we are very thankful for that. Unfortunately, there are still millions upon millions of Muslims around the world following the most outrageous teachings of Islam, and it is causing horrible suffering to this day. So we need to expose this religion, as it is doing more harm than good. It's always a good idea to explain the difference between Muslims, Islam, and Islamists. Muslims are individuals, many of whom do not follow or even know the full extent of Islamic teachings. Islam is the ideology, and Islamism refers to the radical political movement that seeks to impose Islamic law on society, such as the execution of ex-Muslims. Section 11 of the Act is important. It provides the exception stating, a person does not contravene Section 7 or 8 if the person establishes that the person's conduct was engaged in reasonably and in good faith, in the performance, exhibition, or distribution of an artistic work, or in the course of any statement, publication, discussion, or debate made or held, or any other conduct engaged in, for any genuine academic, artistic, religious, or scientific purpose, or any purpose that is in the public interest, or in making or publishing a fair and accurate report of any event or matter of public interest. For the purpose of subsection 1(b)(i), a religious purpose includes, but is not limited to, conveying or teaching a religion or proselytizing. It's important to understand why you are criticizing Islam. For Christians, who are frequently the most involved in criticizing Islam, it may be an attempt to proselytize, which is completely legal. The reasoning is that you are not attempting to incite hate, but rather win converts to your religion. And to do that, you must show that Islam is false. And this brings us to one of the most important cases on this matter. Catch the Fire Ministries Inc. and Oars and Islamic Council of Victoria Inc., 2006, 15 VR 207. As you might expect, the Islamic Council of Victoria tried to use the law against a pastor speaking out on Islam and ultimately failed. Again, Islam always comes with attacks on free speech. Wherever Islam goes, free speech is under attack. Watch my video when it comes out of a Muslim apologist admitting Islam takes away free speech. We have to be extremely grateful that the Islamic Council lost this case. Importantly, if the Islamic Council were wiser, it would have listened to the critiques of Islam, realized that Islam is a false religion, and abandoned it. Instead, in my opinion, they doubled down and tried to diminish the rights of non-Muslims to speak freely on Islam. Shame on them. Even if that wasn't their intent, it would have been the result, in my opinion. Because this is a serious analysis, we are presenting a significant amount from this case. If you are serious about criticizing Islam, I suggest you stick around for this crucial data. Now let's read some important sections of this case. The court stated, I accept that incites in S8 means urges, spurs on, stirs up, animates, or stimulates. That accords with the plain and ordinary meaning of the word and also with the criminal law's conception of incitement, upon which S8 appears loosely to be based. I also allow that incitive conduct is capable of contravening S8 without necessarily causing hatred, or serious contempt, or revulsion, or serious ridicule. As with the common law criminal offense of incitement, I view S8 as directed to inchoate or preliminary conduct, whether or not it causes the kind of third-party response it is calculated to encourage. In that sense, the section is prophylactic. But that said, I do not accept that one should exclude from consideration the nature of the audience to whom the conduct is directed. The idea of the ordinary reasonable reader belongs to the law of defamation. It has as its object the protection of individuals against false allegations calculated to lower them in the esteem of their fellows. Contrastingly, S8 does not prohibit statements about religious beliefs per se, or even statements which are critical or destructive of religious beliefs. Nor does it prohibit statements concerning the religious beliefs of a person or group of persons simply because they may offend or insult the person or group of persons. The prescription is limited to that which incites hatred or other relevant emotion, and S8 must be applied so as to give it that effect. This is a critical point. You are absolutely allowed to criticize religion even if it is destructive of religious belief, and it doesn't matter if people of that group are offended. Muslims can be offended all they like, but that doesn't prevent people from criticizing Islam. What is prohibited is causing people to hate Muslims or other serious negative emotions toward Muslims. That's the key distinction. So you can spread the truth about the horrible Islamic religion, but distinguish that from the people who don't follow most of the evil teachings. Because the reality is, most Muslims are overwhelmingly more moral than their Prophet Muhammad and what Islam commands. In fact, if they really followed Islam to the letter, they would be in prison themselves. So your average Muslim is not following pure Islamic ideology, which is what we seek to criticize. You have to understand this critical distinction between regular Muslims and Islam. That's how you ensure you are not inciting hate against Muslims, but are being critical of the religion. Let's continue. Evidently, there can be no incitement in the absence of an audience. It is not a contravention of S8 to utter exhortations to religious hatred in the isolation of an empty room. If conduct is to incite a reaction, it must reach the mind of the audience. And if conduct is to be perceived as inciting a particular reaction, it must reach the mind of an audience as something which encourages that reaction. So, for conduct to incite hatred or other relevant emotion, it must reach the mind of an audience as something which encourages those emotions. So therefore, the question of whether it has that effect will depend upon the perception of the audience. Of course, where statements are published generally as they might be in a book or newspaper or by posting on a website, one may need to have regard to all manner of persons who are likely to see them and absorb them, but it is otherwise where the audience is select. Thus, for example, it is conceivable that a statement made about religious beliefs in the course of a talkback radio broadcast could run foul of S8 of the Act, while the same thing said as part of intellectual discourse within a seminary or faculty of theology would not have that effect. and examples can be multiplied. In my view, one may usually assume a degree of reasonableness. Moving ahead to another important statement from the court. I do not overlook that Muslims are defined by their religious beliefs, as persons who profess Islam, and therefore that to incite hatred or other relevant emotion of or towards the religious beliefs of a Muslim may result in hatred or other relevant emotion of or towards the Muslim. But it is surely not to be assumed that it must do so. Muslims are not the only class of persons who are defined by their religious beliefs. So are adherents to other faiths, including Judaism and Christianity. And there are any number of persons who may despise each other's faiths and yet bear each other no ill will. I dare say, for example, that there would be a large number of people who would despise Pastor Scott's perception of Christianity and yet not dream of hating him or be inclined to any of the other stipulated emotions. No doubt the purpose of the act is to promote religious tolerance. But the act cannot and does not purport to mandate religious tolerance. People are free to follow the religion of their choice, even if it is averse to other codes. One need only think of the doctrinal differences which separate the several Christian denominations or the Muslim sects in order to see the point. Equally, people are free to attempt to persuade other people to adopt their point of view. Street corner evangelists are a commonplace example. Rightly or wrongly, that is the nature of religion. Or at least it is the nature of some religions as they are understood, and in this country it is tolerated. Accordingly, S8 goes no further in restricting freedom to criticize the religious beliefs of others than to prohibit criticism so extreme as to incite hatred or other relevant emotion of or towards those others. It is essential to keep the distinction between the hatred of beliefs and the hatred of their adherents steadily in view. Beyond that, it is a matter for the law of defamation, or the law relating to misrepresentation and misleading and deceptive conduct, or possibly criminal sanctions. This is critical. You can hate another person's religion without hating the person. The problem with that is that the verity of Pastor Scott's statements about the religious beliefs of Muslims was irrelevant to the matters in issue. The question for the purposes of S8 was whether what was said by Pastor Scott taken as a whole and in context was such as to incite hatred of or other relevant emotion towards Muslims on grounds of their religious beliefs. Whether his statements about the religious beliefs of Muslims were accurate or inaccurate or balanced or unbalanced was incapable of yielding an answer to the question of whether the statements incited hatred or other relevant emotion. Statements about the religious beliefs of a group of persons could be completely false and utterly unbalanced, and yet do nothing to incite hatred of those who adhere to those beliefs. At the same time, statements about the religious beliefs of a group of persons could be wholly true and completely balanced, and yet be almost certain to incite hatred of the group because of those beliefs. In any event, who is to say what is accurate or balanced about religious beliefs? In point of fact, the most that could ever be said is that a given point of view may diverge to a greater or lesser degree from the mainstream of generally accepted views on the subject. In my view, it was calculated to lead to error for a secular tribunal to attempt to assess the theological propriety of what was asserted at the seminar. This case was originally held at VCAT, the Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal, in which the Islamic Council won. It was appealed to the Supreme Court of Victoria, where the original finding was reversed. Absurdly, the original tribunal used outrageous logic about balanced critique and discussing theology, going way beyond the scope of what it is capable of. Significantly, I do not see in that analysis any consideration of why, despite the perceived imbalance of Pastor Scott's assertions about Islam, his exhortations to his audience to love and to witness to Muslims would not have prevented the seminar as a whole inciting hatred or other relevant emotion of or towards Muslims among the non-Muslims to whom the seminar was directed or likely to be conveyed. From here, you can learn that it would benefit you to explain why you are criticizing Islam. Part of the reason should be to benefit Muslims themselves, who are the greatest victims of Islam. Make it clear that although it may seem counterintuitive that criticizing someone's religion is loving, it is in fact an act of love. In reality, hiding the truth about Islam from Muslims is what truly hurts them. Sharing truth is an ultimate act of love. And not only are we willing to share the truth with Muslims, we are willing to risk our safety for it. It is well known that critics of Islam suffer for it with threats, violence, and murder. Yet we do it anyway because it is the right thing to do, and that is what God expects of us. Jews, Christians, and atheists should be united on this. Not out of hate, but out of love, for their benefit and for our benefit. I do not doubt that some Muslims may have regarded Pastor Scott's observations on the meaning of the Quran as deeply offensive, and perhaps been outraged by the fact that things to that effect should be said in a public place, even if the place were no more public than a Catch the Fire Ministries hall in suburban Surrey Hills, and the effect were limited to an audience largely comprised of born-again Christian fundamentalists. I dare say, too, that there may well be people who, although not Muslims, would think it a far better thing if people like Pastor Scott kept his ideas about the Quran and Islam, and for that matter Judaism and Christianity, to himself and left others to do likewise. It is at least arguable that the world would be a happier place if he were bound to do so. But that is not the law. As has been seen, the prohibition in S8 is not a prohibition against saying things about the religious beliefs of persons which are offensive to those persons, or even against saying things about the religious beliefs of one group of persons which would cause another group of persons to despise those beliefs. It is against saying things about the religious beliefs and practices of persons which go so far as to incite other persons to hate persons who adhere to those religious beliefs. And as a matter of logical analysis, it does not suffice to establish incitement to hate a group of persons to show that scorn has been poured on the religious beliefs or practices of that group of persons, although it may be relevant. I find it highly offensive that the court would speculate that staying silent on Islam would make a happier world. Islam is one of the world's biggest barriers to happiness, from attacking music as haram to allowing husbands to hit their wives to terrorism to child marriage. The idea that staying silent on Islam would make things better is outrageous. Now you have a solid grasp of the Tolerance Act and one of the most important cases on the matter. I want to mention a few more things you need to keep in mind. When we criticize Islam, we are sometimes harsh, but when speaking to Muslims, we are not harsh. There is no good reason to disrespect someone just because they are Muslim. In fact, that will do more harm than good. Moreover, encouraging the disrespect or discrimination of Muslims can be seen as a violation of the Act. Do not do this. The ideal is you have respectful conversations with Muslims and ask them questions, even hard questions, depending on the situation. It is important that your goal is not to be offensive for its own sake. Offense is not the goal, education is. We do not do this for fun or laughs. This is serious business. Islam is an unacceptable ideology and must be refuted, especially fundamentalist, radical, and Islamist versions of Islam. We may laugh, but that's not the goal. The goal is to save lives, souls, minds, and hearts. Do not lie or spread falsehood about Islam or Muslims. Your research should be reliable. Of course, everyone gets things wrong, but don't do that intentionally. Do not make the Quran seem worse than it actually is. Do not take things out of context. Do not twist the texts to make Islam look bad. You have to present and argue in good faith. Never incite violence or even suggest or hint of violence as an option, and we will discuss more on that shortly. I want to make a couple more points on Section 11 of the Act, which provides exceptions stating, a person does not contravene Section 7 or 8 if the person establishes that the person's conduct was engaged in reasonably and in good faith, in the performance, exhibition, or distribution of an artistic work, or in the course of any statement, publication, discussion, or debate made or held, or any other conduct engaged in, for any genuine academic, artistic, religious, or scientific purpose, or any purpose that is in the public interest, or in making or publishing a fair and accurate report of any event or matter of public interest. We have covered the religious purpose in depth, and now I want to discuss the public interest purpose. What counts as a purpose in the public interest? The term isn't precisely defined in the legislation, but courts have interpreted it broadly. It generally includes anything that serves the community at large, things that inform, protect, or benefit the public in some meaningful way. For example, exposing dangerous ideologies, raising awareness about harm caused by certain practices, and engaging in honest debate about matters that affect society. These can all fall under public interest. It doesn't mean the public has to agree with you. It just means that your conduct contributes to public debate or scrutiny on issues of legitimate concern. Criticizing ideologies, especially those that influence law, politics, education, or public safety, is a textbook example of public interest. In terms of public interest, it means you do not have to be religious to criticize Islam. Atheists can also contribute to exposing Islamic ideology, and should do so. The more that Islam is reformed or abandoned, the safer and wiser everyone will be, and that is absolutely in the public interest. One technical point I want to mention. Depending on when you're watching this, the Racial and Religious Tolerance Act 2001 will be repealed in June 2026 and replaced by the Justice Legislation Amendment, Anti-Vilification and Social Cohesion, Bill 2024. However, virtually everything discussed in this video remains valid. The core principles and legal standards do not change. In fact, the explanatory memorandum to the new legislation even cites the Catch the Fire case, which we've analyzed in detail, confirming that the same legal reasoning continues to apply. Let me summarize what has been said from the words of the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission. Behavior that is not likely to be vilification includes being critical of a religion, or debating racial or religious ideas in a way that does not encourage others to hate racial or religious groups. Actions that offend people of a particular race or religion, but do not encourage others to hate, disrespect, or abuse racial or religious groups. Now let's conclude with a brief mention of the Criminal Code Amendment, Hate Crimes, Bill 2025. I have a video on this topic for more detail, but for now, it just means that you cannot advocate force or violence. It says, 80.2ba threatening force or violence against groups. 1. A person commits an offense if a. The person threatens to use force or violence against a group, the targeted group, and b. The targeted group is distinguished by race, religion, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, intersex status, disability, nationality, national or ethnic origin or political opinion, and c. A reasonable member of the targeted group would fear that the threat will be carried out, and d. The threat, if carried out, would threaten the peace, order, and good government of the Commonwealth. Quite simple, really. Don't advocate illegal violence in any way whatsoever ever. Don't even hint that you support illegal violence. Don't be reckless with words that may suggest you are advocating violence. Make it absolutely clear you are talking about education and not violence. Explicitly condemn violence. Never justify or minimize anti-Muslim hate crimes. Never encourage people to engage in damaging property of anyone, especially a protected group. If you do, not only are you committing an immoral act, you are risking prison time. You also give the government more excuses to shut down free speech, which is already a fragile right. Violence is not the answer, education is. Part of the reason we criticize Islam in the first place is that it calls for violence against protected groups, so don't be a hypocrite and do what you are criticizing. Please watch my upcoming video on which Islamic teachings are illegal in Australia, where I explain how some Quran and Hadith teachings violate Australian law. In fact, the legislation we discussed today would make preaching certain verses of the Quran illegal. For example, Surah 98:6 says, Jews are the worst of creatures and will burn in hell forever if they don't convert to Islam. I would say that at least incites serious contempt for Jews by dehumanizing them and labeling them worse than any creature. Imagine if we said that Muslims are the worst of creatures? We don't say that, but the Quran says that about Jews. And yet we are supposed to call this a holy book and respect it? No thanks. Any book that calls my people the worst of creatures is not a book I will respect. Now you have a strong idea as to how to expose Islam in Australia without violating the law. I encourage all people to criticize Islam in a legal manner. It is essential to expose falsehood and bring people closer to the truth. Thank you for listening. Please like, subscribe, comment, and share. I don't particularly care about copyright on these videos, so feel free to clip them as long as you give credit. Thanks, and be well.